Now the armies of Gaunest moved against Riven city itself. From all the plundered empire they streamed in, to ring the town in a living wall and hem the defenders within a fence of spears. And when the whole host was gathered, which took about 10 sleeps from the time the Kilorners arrived, they stormed the city. Up the long slope of the hills on which Riven stood they came, running, bounding, holding up shields against the steady hail of missiles from the walls. Forward, silent and blank-faced, no noise in them save the crashing of thousands of feet and the high demon music of their war-making, dying, strewing the ground with their corpses, but leaping over the fallen and raging against the walls. Up ladders. Rams thundering at the gates. Men springing to the top of walls and toppling before the defenders and more of them snarling behind. Back and forth the battle raged, now the Rivanians driven back to the streets and rooftops, now the Darklanders pressed to the edge of the walls and pitchforked over. Houses began to burn, here and there, and it was Sathi who made fire brigades out of those who could not fight. Carrie had a glimpse of her from afar, as he battled on the outer parapets, a swift and golden loveliness against the leaping red. After long and vicious fighting the northern gate went down. But Bran had foreseen this. He had pulled most of his barbarians thither, with Carrie's bulls in their lead. He planted them well back and had a small stout troop on either side of the great buckling doors. When the barrier sagged on its hinges, the Gaunesti roared in unopposed, streaming through the entrance and down the broad bloody avenue. Then the Kilorners thrust from the side, pinching off the several hundred who had entered. They threw great jars of oil on the broken gates and set them ablaze, a barrier of flame which none could cross. And then Carrie rode his bulls against the enemy, and behind him came the might of Kilorn. It was raw slaughter. Ere long they were hunting the foe up and down the streets and spearing them like wild animals. Meanwhile Bran got some engineers from Jonan's force who put up a temporary barricade in a now open gateway and stood guard over it. The storm faded, grumbled away in surges of blood and whistling arrows. Shaken by their heavy losses, the Darklanders pulled back out of missile range, ringed the city with their watchfires, and prepared to lay siege. There was jubilation in Riven. Men shouted and beat their dented shields with nicked and blunted swords. They tossed their javelins in the air, emptied wineskins, and kissed the first and best girl who came to hand. Weary, bleeding, reft of many good comrades, and given at best a reprieve, the folk still snatched at what laughter remained. Bran came striding to meet the queen. He was a huge and terrible figure stiff with dry blood, the axe blinking on his shoulder and the other hairy paw clamped on the neck of a tall Darklander whom he helped along with an occasional kick. Yet Sathi's dark eyes trailed to the slim form of Carrie, following in the chief's wake and too exhausted to say much. "I caught this fellow in the streets, my lady," said Bran merrily, "and since he seemed to be a leader I thought I'd better hang on to him for a while." The invader stood motionless, regarding them with a chill yellow stare in which there lay an iron pride. He was tall and well built, his black mail silver-trimmed, a silver star on the battered black helmet. The snowy hair and beard stirred faintly in the breeze. "An aristocrat, I would say," nodded Sathi. She herself seemed almost too tired to stand. She was smudged with smoke and her dress was torn and her small hands bleeding from their recent burdens. But she pulled herself erect and fought to speak steadily. "Yes, he may well be of value to us. That was good work. Aye, you men of Kilorn fought nobly, without you we might well have lost the city. It was a good month when you came." "It was no way to fight," snapped Jonan. He was tired and wounded himself, but there was no comradeship in the look he gave the Northerners. "The risk of it, why, if you hadn't been able to seal the gate behind them, Riven would have fallen then and there." "I did not see you doing much of anything when the gate was splintering before them," answered Bran curtly. "As it is, my lady, we've inflicted such heavy losses on them that I doubt they'll consider another attempt at storming. Which gives us, at least, time to try something else." He yawned mightily. "Time to sleep." Jonan stepped up close to the prisoner and they exchanged a long look. There was no way to read the Darklander's thoughts, but Carrie thought he saw a tension under the general's hard-held features. "I don't know what value a food-eating prisoner is to us when he can't even speak our language," said the Rivanian. "However, I can take him in charge if you wish." "Do," she nodded dully. "Odd if he couldn't talk any Auyuardian at all," said Carrie. "Wanderers through alien lands almost have to learn. The leaders of invading armies ought to know the tongue of their enemy, or at least have interpreters. He grinned with the cold savagery of the Broyina. "Let the women of Killorn, the ones who've lost husbands today, have him for a while. I dare say you'll soon discover he knows your speech, whatever is left of him." "No," said Jonan flatly. He signaled to a squad of his men. "Take this fellow down to the palace dungeons and give him something to eat. I'll be along later." Carrie started to protest, but Sathi laid a hand on his arm. He felt how it was still bleeding a little and grew silent. "Let Jonan take care of it," she said, her voice flat with weariness. "We all need rest now, oh gods, to sleep." The Killorners had moved their wagons into the great forum and camped there, much to the disgust of the aristocrats and to the pleasure of whatever tavern keepers and unattached young women lived nearby. But Sathi had insisted that their 3 chiefs should be honored guests at the palace, and it pleased them well enough to have private chambers and plenty of servants and the best of wine. Carrie woke in his bed and lay for a long while, drowsing and thinking the wondrous thoughts of half asleep. When he got up he groaned, for he was stiff with his wounds in the long fury of battle. A slave came in and rubbed him with oil and brought him a barbarian-sized meal, after which he felt better. But now he was restless. He felt the letdown which is the aftermath of high striving. It was hard to fight back the misery and loneliness that rose in him. He prowled the room unhappily, pacing under the glowing cressets, flinging himself on a couch and then springing to his feet again. The walls were a cage. The city was a cage, a trap. He was caught like a snared beast, and never again would he walk the moors of Killorn. Sharply as a knife thrust, he remembered hunting once out in the heath. He had gone alone, with spear and bow and a shaggy half-wild signer loping at his heels, out after antlered prey somewhere beyond the little village. Long had they roamed, he and his beast, until they were far from sight of man, and only the great grand purple and gold of the moors were around them. The carpet under his bare feet seemed again to be the springy, pungent ling of Killorn. It was as if he smelled the sharp wild fragrance of it and felt the leaves brushing his ankles. It had been grand windy, clouds rushed out of the west on a mounting gale. There was rain in the air, and high overhead a single bird of prey had wheeled and looped on lonely wings. Oh almighty gods, how the wind had sung and cried to him, chilled his body with raw wet gusts, and skirled in the dales and roared beneath the darkening heavens. And he had come down a long rocky slope into a wooded glen. A waterfall rushed and foamed along his path, white and green and angry black. He had sheltered in a mossy cave, lain and listened to the wind and the rain and the crystal, ringing waterfall, and when the weather cleared he had gotten up and gone home. There had been no quarry, but by morn of day that failure meant more to him than all his victories since. He picked up the pipe of the gods, where it lay with his armor, and turned it over and over in his hands. Old it was, dark with age. The pipes were of some nameless iron-like wood, and a bag of a leather such as was never seen now. It was worn with the uncounted generations of Broinas who had had it, men made hard and stern by their frightful trust. It had scattered the legions of the Southerners who came conquering 100 years ago, and it had quelled the raiding savages from Norla, and it had gone with one-eyed awry and shouted down the walls of a city. And more than once, on this last dreadful march, it had saved the men of Killorn. Now it was dead. The piper of Killorn had fallen, and the secret had perished with him, and the folk it had warded were trapped like animals to die of hunger and pestilence in a strange land. O Ryak, Ryak my father, come back from the dead, come back and put the pipe to your cold lips and play the war song of Killorn. Carrie blew in it for the 100th time, and only a hollow whistling sounded in the belly of the instrument. Not even a decent tune, he thought bitterly. He couldn't stay indoors. He had to get out under the sky again or go mad. Slinging the pipe over his shoulder he went out the door and up the long stairway to the palace roof gardens. They slept all around him. Sleep and silence were heavy in the long corridors. It was as if he were the last man alive and walked alone through the ruins of the world. He came out on the roof and went over to the parapet and stood looking out. The moon was near the zenith, which meant, at this longitude, that it was somewhat less than half full and would dwindle as it sank westward. It rode serene in the dusky sky, adding its pale glow to the diffused light which filled all the twilight lands and to the white pyre of the hidden sun. The city lay dark and silent under the sky, sleeping heavily. Only the muted tramp of sentries and their ringing calls drifted up to Carrie. Beyond the town burned the ominous red circle of the Gonesti fires, and he could see their tents and the black forms of their warriors. They were settling down to a patient death watch. All the land had become silent, waiting for Riven to die. It did not seem right that he should stand here among fragrant gardens and feel the warm western breeze on his face, not when steadfast Lewin and Burrowed the strong and gay young Ca-Ermac his comrade were ashen corpses with the women of Killorn keening over them. "O Killorn, Killorn, and the Lake of Sunset, have their ghosts gone home to you? Greet Morna for me, Ca-Ermac, whisper in the wind that I love her, tell her not to grieve." He grew aware that someone else was approaching, and turned with annoyance. But his mood lightened when he saw that it was Sathi. She was very fair as she walked toward him, young and lithe and beautiful, with the dark unbound hair floating about her. "Are you up, Kiri?" she asked, sitting down on the parapet beside him. "Of course, my lady, or else you are dreaming," he smiled with a tired humor. Stupid question, wasn't it? She smiled back with a curving of closed lips that was lovely to behold. "But I am not feeling very bright just now." "None of us are, my lady." "Oh, forget that sort of address, Kiri. I am too lonely as it is, sitting on a throne above all the world. Call me by my name, at least." "You are very kind, Sathi." "That is better." She smiled again, wistfully. "How you fought today. How you reaped them. What sort of a warrior are you, Kiri, to ride wild bulls as if they were hests?" "We of Clan Broyina have tricks. We feel things that other men do not seem to." Kiri sat down beside her, feeling the frozenness within him ease a little. It can be lonely to wield power and you wonder if you are fit for it, not so? My father died in our first battle with the Gonesti, and now I am the Broyina, but who am I to lead my clan? I cannot even perform the first duty of my post." "And what is that?" she asked. He told her about the god pipe. He showed it to her and gave her the tales of its singing. "You feel your flesh shiver and your bones begin to crumble, rocks dance and mountains groan and the gates of hell open before you, but now the pipes are forever silent, Sathi. No man knows how to play them." "I heard of your music at that battle," she nodded gravely, and wondered why it was not sounded again this time. Awe and fear were in her eyes. The hand that touched the scarred sack trembled a little. "And this is the pipe of Killorn. You cannot play it again? You cannot find out how? It would be the saving of Riven and of your own folk and perhaps of all the Twilight lands, Kiri." "I know. But what can I do? Who can understand the powers of heaven or unlock the doors of hell save Lugan Longsword himself?" "I do not know. But Kiri, I wonder. This pipe. Do you really think that gods and not men wrought it? Who but a god could make such a thing, Sathi?" "I do not know, I say. And yet, tell me, have you any idea of what the world is like in Killorn? Do you think it a flat plain with the sun hanging above, forever fixed in one spot?" "Why, I suppose so. Though we have met men in the Southlands who claimed the world was a round ball and went about the sun in such a manner as always to turn the same face to it." "Yes, the wise men of Riven tell us that that must be the case. They have learned it by studying the fixed stars and those which wander. Those others are worlds like our own, they say, and the fixed stars are suns a very long ways off. And we have a very dim legend of a time once, long and long and long ago, when this world did not eternally face the sun either. It spun like a top so that each side of it had light and dark alternately." Kiri knitted his brows trying to see that for himself. At last he nodded. "Well, it may have been. What of it? The barbarians all think the world was born in flame and thunder many ages ago. But some of our thinkers believe that this creation was a catastrophe which destroyed that older world I speak of. There are dim legends and here and there we find very ancient ruins, cities greater than any we know today but buried and broken so long ago that even their building stones are almost withered away. These thinkers believe that man grew mighty on this forgotten world which spun about itself, that his powers were like those we today call divine. Then something happened. We cannot imagine what, though a wise man once told me he believed all things attract each other, that is the reason why they fall to the ground, he said, and that another world swept so close to ours that its pull stopped the spinning and yanked the moon closer than it had been. Kiri clenched his fists. "It could be," he murmured. "It could well be. For what happens to an unskillful rider when his hest stops all at once? He goes flying over its head, right? Even so, this breaking of the world would have brought earthquakes greater than we can imagine, quakes that leveled everything. You have a quick wit. That is what this man told me. At any rate, only a very few people and animals lived and nothing remained of their great works save legends. In the course of many ages, man and beasts alike changed, the beasts more than man who can make his own surroundings to suit. Life spread from the daylands through the twilight zone. Plants got so they could use what little light we have here. Finally even the dark lands were invaded by the pallid growths which can live there. Animals followed and man came after the animals until today things are as you see. She turned wide and serious eyes on him. Could not this pipe have been made in the early days by a man who knew some few of the ancient secrets? No god but a man even as you, Carrie. And what one man can make another can understand. Hope rose in him and sagged again. How? He asked dully. And then, seeing the tears glimmer in her eyes, oh, it may all be true. I will try my best. But I do not even know where to begin. Try, she whispered. Try. But do not tell anyone that the pipe is silent, Sathi. Perhaps I should not even have told you. Why not? I am your friend and the friend of your folk. I would we had all the tribes of Kilorn here. Jonan is not, he said grimly. Jonan, he is a harsh man, yes. But he does not like us. I do not know why but he doesn't. He is a strange one, she admitted. He is not even of Rivanian birth, he is from Guria, a city which we conquered long ago, though of course its people have long been full citizens of the empire. He wants to marry me, did you know? She smiled. I could not help laughing for he is so stiff. One would as soon wed an iron cuirass. Wed, Carrie fell silent, and there was a dream in his gaze as he looked over the hills. What are you thinking of? She asked after a while. Oh, home, he said. I was wondering if I would ever see Kilorn again. She leaned over closer to him. One long black lock brushed his hand and he caught the faint fragrance of her. Is it so fair land? She asked softly. No, he said. It is harsh and grey and lonely. Storm winds sweep in and the sea roars on rocky beaches and men grow gnarled with resting life from the stubborn soil. But there is space and sky and freedom, there are the little huts and the great halls, the chase and the games and the old songs around leaping fires, and, well, his voice trailed off. You left a woman behind, didn't you? She murmured gently. He nodded. Morna of she of the sun-bright tresses and the fair young form and the laughter that was like rain showering on thirsty ground. We were very much in love. But she did not come too? No. So many wanted to come that the unwed had to draw lots and she lost. Nor could I stay behind for I was heir to the Broyina and the god pipes would be mine someday. He laughed, a harsh sound like breaking iron. You see how much good that has done me. But even so, you could have married her before leaving? No. Such hasty marriage is against clan law and Morna would not break it. Carrie shrugged. So we wandered out of the land, and I have not seen her since. But she will wait for me and I for her. We'll wait till, he had half raised his hand but as he saw again the camp of the besiegers it fell helplessly to his lap. And you would not say? Sathi's tones were so low he had to bend his head close to hear. Even if somehow Riven threw back its foes and valiant men were badly needed and could rise to the highest honors of the empire, you would not stay here? For a moment Carrie sat motionless, wrapping himself about his innermost being. He had some knowledge of women. There had been enough of them along the dusty way, brief encounters and a fading memory. His soul had room only for the bright image of one unforgotten girl. It was plain enough what this woman, who was young and beautiful and a queen, was saying and he would not ordinarily have hung back. Especially when the folk of Kilorn were still strangers in a camp of allies who did not trust them very far, when Kilorn needed every friend it could find. And the Broyina were an elvish clan who had never let overly many scruples hold them. Only he liked Sathi as a human being. She was brave and generous and wise and she was, really, so pitiably young. She had had so little chance to learn the hard truths of living in the loneliness of the Imperium and only a scoundrel would hurt her. She sighed, ever so faintly, and moved back a little. Carrie thought he saw her stiffening. One does not reject the offer of a queen. Sathi, he said, for you, perhaps, even a man of Kilorn might forget his home. She half turned to him, hesitating, unsure of herself and him. He took her in his arms and kissed her. Carrie, she whispered, and her lips stole back toward his. He felt rather than heard a footfall and turned with the animal alertness of the barbarian. Jonan stood watching them. Pardon me, said the general harshly. His countenance was strained. Then suddenly, "Your Majesty! This savage mauling you!" Sathi lifted a proud dark head. "This is the prince consort of Imperial Riven," she said haughtily. "Conduct yourself accordingly. You may go." Jonan snarled and lifted an arm. Carrie saw the armed men step from behind the tall flowering hedges and his sword came out with a rasp of steel. "Guards!" screamed Sathi. The men closed in. Carrie's blade whistled against one shield. Another came from each side. Pike shafts thudded against his bare head. He fell, toppling into a roaring darkness while they clubbed him again. Down and down and down, whirling into a chasm of night. Dimly, just before blankness came, he saw the white beard and the mask-like face of the prince from Gonist. It was a long and hard ride before they stopped and Carrie almost fell from the hest to which they had bound him. "I should have thought that you would soon awake," said the man from Gonist. He had a soft voice and spoke Hauardian well enough. "I am sorry. It is no way to treat a man, carrying him like a sack of meal. Here." He poured a glass of wine and handed it to the barbarian. "From now on you shall ride erect." Carrie gulped thirstily and felt a measure of strength flowing back. He looked around him. They had gone steadily eastward and were now camped near a ruined farmhouse. A fire was crackling and one of the score or so of enemy warriors was roasting a haunch of meat over it. The rest stood leaning on their weapons and their cold amber eyes never left the two prisoners. Sathi stood near bleak-faced Jonan and her great dark eyes never left Carrie. He smiled at her shakily and with a little sob she took a step toward him. Jonan pulled her back roughly. "Carrie," she whispered. "Carrie, are you well?" "As well as could be expected," he said wryly. Then to the Gonistian prince, "What is this, anyway? I woke up to find myself joggling eastward and that is all I know. What is your purpose?" "We have several," answered the alien. He sat down near the fire pulling his cloak around him against the chill that blew out of the glooming east. His impassive face watched the dance of flames as if they told him something. Carrie sat down as well, stretching his long legs easily. He might as well relax, he thought. They had taken his sword and his pipes and they were watching him like hungry beasts. There was never a chance to fight. "Come, Sathi," he waved to the girl. "Come over here by me." "No," snapped Jonan. "Yes, if she wants to," said the Gonistian mildly. "By that filthy barbarian. None of us have washed recently." The gentle tones were suddenly like steel. "Do not forget, General, that I am Mongku of Gonist and heir apparent to the throne." "And I rescue you from the city," snapped the man. "If it weren't for me you might well be dead at the hands of that red savage." "That will do," said Mongku. "Come over here and sit by us, Sathi." His guardsmen stirred, unacquainted with the Rivanian tongue but sensing the clash of wills. Jonan shrugged sullenly and stalked over to sit opposite them. Sathi fled to Carrie and huddled against him. He comforted her awkwardly. Over her shoulder he directed a questioning look at Mongku. "I suppose you deserve some explanation," said the Darklander. "Certainly Sathi must know the facts." He leaned back on one elbow and began to speak in an almost dreamy tone. "When Riven conquered Guria, many generations ago, some of its leaders were proscribed. They fled eastward and so eventually wandered into the Darklands and came to Gonist. It was then merely a barbarian town but the Gurians became advisors to the king and began teaching the people all the arts of civilization. It was their hope one day to lead the hosts of Gonist against Riven, partly for revenge and partly for the wealth and easier living to be found in the Twilight Lands. Life is hard and bitter in the eternal night, Sathi. It is ever a struggle merely to keep alive. Can you wonder so very much that we are spilling into your gentler climate and your richer soil? Descendants of the Gurians have remained aristocrats in Gonist. But Jonan's father conceived the idea of moving back with a few of his friends to work from within against the day of conquest. At that time we were bringing our neighbors under our heel and looked already to the time when we should move against the Twilight Lands. At any rate he did this and nobody suspected that he was all but a newcomer from another part of Riven's empire. His son, Jonan, entered the army and, being shrewd and strong and able, finally reached the high post which you yourself bestowed on him, Sathi. Oh, no, Jonan, she shuddered against Carrie. Naturally when we invaded at last he had to fight against us, and for fear of prisoners revealing his purpose very few Gonistians know who he really is. A risk was involved, Yes. But it is convenient to have a general of the enemy on your side. Jonan is one of the major reasons for our success. Now we come to myself, a story which is very simply told. I was captured and it was Jonan's duty as a citizen of Gonist to rescue his prince, quite apart from the fact that I do know his identity and torture might have loosened my tongue. He might have effected my escape easily enough without attracting notice, but other factors intervened. For one thing, there was this barbarian alliance, and especially that very dangerous new weapon they had which he had observed in use. We clearly could not risk its being turned on us. Indeed we almost had to capture it. Then, too, Jonan is desirous of marrying you, Sathi, and I must say that it seems a good idea. With you as a hostage Riven will be more amenable. Later you can return as nominal ruler of your city, a vassal of Gonist, and that will make our conquest easier to administer. Though not too easy, I fear. The Twilight Landers will not much like being transported into the Darklands to make room for us. Sathi began to cry, softly and hopelessly. Carrie stroked her hair and said nothing. Monku sat up and reached for the chunk of meat his soldier handed him. So Jonan and his few trusty men let me out of prison and we went up to the palace roof after you, who had been seen going that way shortly before. Listening a little while to your conversation we saw that we had had the good luck to get that hell pipe of the north, too. So we took you. Jonan was for killing you, Curry my friend, but I pointed out that you could be useful in many ways such as a means for making Sathi listen to reason. Threats against you will move her more than against herself, I think. You crawling louse, said Curry tonelessly. Monku shrugged. I'm not such a bad sort but war is war and I have seen the folk of Gonist hungering too long to have much sympathy for a bunch of fat Twilight Landers. At any rate, we slipped out of the city unobserved. Jonan could not remain for when the Queen and I were both missing, and he responsible for both, it would be plain to many whom to accuse. Moreover, Sathi's future husband is too valuable to lose in a fight. And I myself would like to report to my father the king as to how well the war has gone. So we are bound for Gonist. There was a long silence while the fire leaped and crackled and the stars blinked far overhead. Finally Sathi shook herself and sat erect and said in a small hard voice, Jonan, I swear you will die if you wed me. I promise you that. The officer did not reply. He sat brooding into the dusk with a look of frozen contempt and weariness on his face. Sathi huddled back against Carrie's side and soon she slept. On and on. They were out of the Twilight Lands altogether now. Night had fallen on them and still they rode eastward. They were tough, these Gonesti, they stopped only for sleep and quickly gulped food and a change of mounts and the miles reeled away behind them. Little was said on the trail. They were too tired at the halts and seemingly in too much of a hurry while riding. With Sathi there could only be a brief exchange of looks, a squeeze of hands, and a few whispered words with the glowing-eyed men of Gonist looking on. She was a gallant girl, thought Carrie. The cruel trek told heavily on her but she rode without complaint, she was still queen of Riven. Riven, how long could it hold out now in the despair of its loss? Carrie thought that Red Bran might be able to seize the mastery and whip the city into fighting pitch but warfare by starvation was not to the barbarian stomachs. They could not endure a long siege. But what lay ahead for him and her and the captured weapon of the gods? Never had he been in so grim a country. It was dark, eternally dark, night and cold and the brilliant frosty stars lay over the land, shadows and snow and a whining wind that ate and gnawed its way through furs and flesh down to the bone. The moon got fuller here than it ever did over the twilight belt, its chill white radiance spilled on reaching snowfields and glittered like a million pinpoint stars fallen frozen to earth. He saw icy plains and tumbled black chasms and fanged crags sheathed in glaciers. The ground rang with cold. Cramped and shuddering in his sleeping bag, he heard the thunder of frost-split rocks, the sullen boom and rumble of avalanches, now and again the faint far despairing howl of prowling wild beasts of prey. How can anyone live here? He asked Monk once. The land is dead. It froze to death 10,000 years ago. It is a little warmer in the region of Gonist, said the prince. Volcanoes and hot springs. And there is a great sea which has never frozen over. It has fish, and animals that live off them, and men that live off the animals. But in truth only the broken and hunted of man can ever have come here. We are the disinherited and we are claiming no more than our rightful share of life in returning to the Twilight Lands. He added thoughtfully, I have been looking at that weapon of yours, Carrie. I think I know the principle of its working. Sound does many strange things, and there are even sounds too low or too high for the human ear to catch. A singer who holds the right note long enough can make a wine glass vibrate in sympathy until it shatters. We built a bridge once, over Thunder Gorge near Gonist, but the wind blowing between the rock walls seemed to make it shake in a certain rhythm that finally broke it. Oh, yes, if the proper sympathetic notes can be found, much may be done. I don't know what hell's music that pipe is supposed to sound. But I found that the reeds can be tautened or loosened, and that the shape of the bag can be subtly altered by holding it in the right way. Find the proper combination and I can well believe that even the small noise made with one man's breath can kill and break and crumble. He nodded his gaunt half-human face in the ruddy blaze of fire. I'll find the notes, Carrie, and then the pipe will play for Gonist. The barbarian shuddered with more than the cold, searching wind. Gods, if he did, if the pipes should sound the final dirge of Killorn. For a moment he had a wild desire to fling himself on Mongku, rip out the prince's throat and kill the score of enemy soldiers with his hands. But no, it wouldn't do. He would die before he had well started, and Sathi would be alone in the dark lands. He looked at her, sitting very quiet near the fire. The wavering light seemed to wash her fair young form in blood. She gave him a tired and hopeless smile. Brave girl, wife for a warrior in all truth. But there was the pipe, and there was Killorn, and there was Morna waiting for him to come home. They were nearing Gonist, she knew. They had ridden past springs that seethed and bubbled in the snow, seen the red glare of volcanoes on the jagged horizon, past fields of white fungus growths which the Darklanders cultivated. Soon the iron gates would clash shut on him, and what hope would there be then? He lay back in his sleeping bag trying to think. He had to escape. Somehow he must escape with the pipe of the gods. But if he tried and went down with a dozen spears in him, there was an end of all hope. The wind blew, drifting snow across the sleepers. Two men stood guard, and their strangely glowing eyes never left the captives. They could see in this realm of shadows where he was half blind. They could hunt him down like an animal. What to do? On the road he went with his hands tied behind him, his ankles lashed to the stirrups, and his hest's bridle tied to the pommel of another man's saddle. No chance of escape there. But one must get up after sleep. He rolled close to Sathi's quiet form as if he were merely turning over in slumber. His lips brushed against the leather bag, and he wished it were her face. Sathi, he whispered as quietly as he could. Sathi, don't move, but listen to me. Her voice drifted back under the wind and the cold. Darling. I am going to make a break for it when we get up. Help me if you can, but don't risk getting hurt. I don't think we can both get away, but wait for me in Gonist. She lay silent for a long while. Then, as you will, Carrie. And whatever comes, I love you. He should have replied, but the words stuck in his throat. He rolled back and, quite simply, went to sleep. A spear butt prodding his side awoke him. He yawned mightily and sat up, loosening his bag around him, tensing every muscle in his body. The end of this ride will see us in the city, Mongku said. Carrie rose slowly, gauging distances. A guardsman stood beside him, spear loose in one hand. The rest were scattered around the camp or huddled close to the fire. The hests were a darker shadow bunched on the fringes. Carrie wrenched the spear of the nearest man loose, swinging one booted foot into his belly. He brought the weapon around in a smashing arc, cracking the heavy butt into another's jaw and rammed the head into the throat of a third. Even as he stabbed, he was plunging into motion. A Gonistian yelled and thrust at him. Sathi threw herself on the shaft, pulling it down. Carrie leaped for the hests. There were two men on guard there. One drew a sword and hewed at the northerner. The keen blade slashed through heavy tunic and undergarments, cutting his shoulder, but not too badly. He came under the fellow's guard and smashed a fist into his jaw. Seizing the weapon, he whirled and hacked at the other Darklander, beating down the soldier's axe and cutting him across the face. The rest of the camp was charging at him. Carrie bent and cut the hobbles of the hest beside him. A shower of flung spears rained about him as he sprang to the saddleless back. Twisting his left hand into the long mane, he kicked the frightened beast in the flanks and plunged free. To Gonist he quartered across his trail. He bent low over the hest's back, spurring them out with the point of his sword. As he rode down on them he hewed at one and saw him fall with a scream. The other stumbled out of the path of his reckless charge. "Hi-ah!" shouted Carrie. He clattered away over the stony icy fields toward the shelter of the dark hills looming to the north. Spears and arrows whistled on his trail and he heard, dimly, the shouts of men and the thud of pursuing hooves. He was alone in a land of foes, a land of freezing cold where he could scarce see half a mile before him, a land of hunger and swords. They were after him and it would take all the hunter's skill he had learned in Kilorn and all the warrior's craftiness taught by the march to evade them. And after that, gonest. The city loomed dark before him reaching with stony fingers for the ever-glittering stars. Of black stone it was, mountainous walls ringing in the narrow streets and the high gaunt houses. A city of night, city of darkness. Carrie shivered. Behind the city rose a mountain, a deeper shadow against the frosty dark of heaven. It was a volcano and from its mouth a red flame flapped in the keening wind. Sparks and smoke streamed over gonest. There was a hot smell of sulfur in the bitter air. The fire added a faint blood-like tinge to the cold glitter of moonlight and starlight on the snowfields. There was a highway leading through the great main gates and the glowing-eyed people of the dark lands were trafficking along it. Carrie strode directly on his way, through the crowds and ever closer to the city. He wore the ordinary fur and leather dress of the country that he had stolen from an outlying house. The parka hood was drawn low to shadow his alien features. He went armed, as most men did, sword belted to his waist, and because he went quietly and steadily nobody paid any attention to him. But if he were discovered and the hue and cry went up that would be the end of his quest. A dozen sleeps of running and hiding in the wild hills, shivering with cold and hunger, hunting animals which could see where he was blind, and ever the men of Gonest on his trail, it would all go for naught. He would die and Sathi would be bound to a hateful pledge and Kilorn would in time be the home of strangers. He must finally have shaken off pursuit, he thought. Ranging through the hills he had found no sign of the warriors who had scoured them before. So he had proceeded toward the city on his wild and hopeless mission. To find a woman and a weapon in the innermost citadel of a foe whose language even was unknown to him, truly the gods must be laughing. He was close to the gates now. They loomed over him like giants, and the passage through the city wall was a tunnel. Soldiers stood on guard and Carrie lowered his head. Traffic streamed through. No one gave him any heed. But it was black as hell in the tunnel and only a Gonestian could find his way. Blindly Carrie walked ahead, bumping into people, praying that none of the angry glances he got would unmask his pretense. When he came out into the street the breath was sobbing in his lungs. He pushed on down its shadowy length feeling the wind that howled between the buildings cold on his cheeks. But where to go now, where to go? Blindly he struck out toward the heart of town. Most rulers preferred to live at the center. The Gonesti were a silent folk. Men stole past in the gloom, noiseless save for the thin snow scrunching under their feet. Crowds eddied dumbly through the great market squares, buying and selling with a gesture or a whispered syllable. City of half-seen ghosts, Carrie felt more than half a ghost himself, shade of a madman flitting hopelessly to the citadel of the King of Hell. He found the place at last, more by blind blundering through the narrow twisting streets than anything else. Drawing himself into the shadow of a building across the way he stood looking at it, weighing his chances. There was a high wall around the palace. He could only see its roof but it seemed to be set well back. He spied a gate not too far off, apparently a secondary entrance for it was small and only one sentry guarded it. Now! By all the gods, now! For a moment his courage failed him, and he stood sweating and shivering and licking dry lips. It wasn't fear of death. He had lived too long with the dark gods as comrade. He had but little hope of escaping alive from these nighted hills. But he thought of the task before him, and the immensity of it and the ruin that lay in his failure, and his heartbeat nearly broke through his ribs. What, after all, could he hope to do? What was his plan, anyway? He had come to Gonest on a wild and hopeless journey, scarcely thinking one sleep ahead of his death-dogged passage. Only now he must reach a decision, and he couldn't. With a snarl, Carrie started across the street. No one else was in sight, there was little traffic in this part of town, but at any moment someone might round either of the corners about which the way twisted and see what he was doing. He had to be fast. He walked up to the sentry who gave him a haughty glance. There was little suspicion in it, for what had anyone to fear in the hearth of Gonist the Mighty? Carry drew his sword and lunged. The sentry yelled and brought down his pike. Carry batted the shaft aside even as he went by it. His sword flashed, stabbing for the other man's throat. With a dreadful gurgling the guard stumbled and went clattering to earth. Now quickly. Carry took the man's helmet and put it on. His own long locks were fair enough to pass for Gonistian at a casual glance, and the visor would hide his eyes. Shedding his parka, he slipped on the blood-stained tunic and the cloak over that. Taking the pike in hand, he went through the gate. Someone cried out and feet clattered in the street and along the garden paths before him. The noise had been heard. Carry looked wildly around at the pale bushes of fungus that grew here under the moon. He crawled between the fleshy fronds of the nearest big one and crouched behind it. Guardsmen ran down the path. The moonlight blinked like cold silver on their spearheads. Carry wriggled on his stomach through the garden of fungus, away from the trail but toward the Black Palace. Lying under a growth at the edge of a frost-silvered expanse of open ground, he scouted the place he must next attack. The building was long and rambling, seemingly 4 stories high, built of polished black marble. There were 2 guards in sight, standing warily near a door. The rest must have run off to investigate the alarm. 2. Carry roused, catching his stride even as he did, and dashed from the garden toward them. The familiar helmet and tunic might assure them for the instant he needed, but he had to run lest they notice. "Vashtung!" shouted one of the men. His meaning was plain enough. Carry launched his pike at the other, who still looked a bit uncertain. It was an awkward throwing weapon. It brought him down wounded in a clatter of metal. The other roared and stepped forth to meet the assault. Carry's sword was out and whirring. He chopped at the pike shaft that jabbed at him, caught his blade in the tough wood and pushed the weapon aside. As he came up face to face, he kneed the Gonistian with savage precision. The other man reached up and grabbed his ankle and pulled him down. Carry snarled, the rage of battle rising in him. It was as if the pipes of Broyinus gurgled in his head. Fear and indecision were gone. He got his hands on the soldier's neck and wrenched. Even as the spine snapped, he was rising again to his feet. He picked up sword and pike and ran up the stairs and through the door. Now, Sathi. He had one ally in this house of hell. A long and silent corridor, lit by dim red crucits, stretched before him. He raced down it and his boots woke hollow echoes that paced him through its black length. 2 men in the dress of servants stood in the room into which he burst. They stared wildly at him. He stabbed one, but the other fled screaming. He'd give the alarm, but there was no time to chase. No time. A staircase wound up toward the 2nd story and Carry took it, flying up 3 steps at a time. Dimly, below him, he heard the frantic tattoo of a giant gong, the alarm signal, but the demon fury was fire and ice in his blood. Another servant gaped at him. Carry seized him with a rough hand and held a sword at his throat. "Sathi," he snarled. "Sathi, Riven, Sathi." The Gonistian gibbered in a panic that seemed weird with his frozen face. Carry grinned viciously and pinked him with the blade. "Sathi," he said urgently. "Sathi of Riven." Shaking, the servant led the way, Carry urging him ungently to greater speed. They went up another flight of stairs and down a hallway richly hung with furs and tapestries. Passing lackeys gaped at them and some ran. Gods, they'd bring Algonist down on his neck. Before a closed door stood a guardsman. Carry slugged the servant when he pointed at that entrance and ran to meet this next barrier. The guard yelled and threw up his pike. Carry's own long-shafted weapon clashed forth. They stabbed at each other, seeking the vitals. The guardsman had a cuirass and Carry's point grazed off the metal. He took a ripping slash in his left arm. The Gonistian bored in, wielding his pike with skill, beating aside Carry's guard. The Twilight Lander dropped his own weapon, seized the other haft in both hands, and drenched. Grimly the Gonistian hung on. Carry worked his way in closer. Suddenly he released the shaft, almost fell against his enemy, and drew the Dark Lander's sword. The short blade flashed and the sentry fell. The door was barred. He beat on it frantically, hearing the clatter of feet coming up the stairs, knowing that a thunderstorm of hurled weapons was on its way. "Sathi!" he cried. "Sathi, it is Carry, let me in." The first soldiers appeared down at the end of the corridor. Carry threw himself against the door. It opened, and he plunged through and slammed down a bolt. Sathi stood there and wonder was in her eyes. "Oh, Carrie," she breathed. "Carrie, you came." "No time," he rasped. "Where is the pipe of Kilorn?" She fought for calmness. "Monku has it," she said. "His chambers are on the next floor, above these." The door banged and groaned as men threw their weight against it. Sathi took his hand and led him into the next room. A fire burned low in the hearth. "I thought it out, against the time you might come," she said. "The only way out is up that chimney. It should take us to the roof and thence we can go down again." "Oh, well done, lass." With a sweep of the poker Carrie scattered the logs and coals out on the carpet while Sathi barred the door into the next room. Drawing a deep breath, the Kilorner went into the fireplace, braced feet and back against the sides of the flue and began to climb up. Smoke swirled in the chimney. He gasped for breath and his lungs seemed on fire. Night in here, utter dark and choking of foul air. His heart roared and his strength ebbed from him. Up and up and up, hitch yourself still further up. "Carrie." Her voice came low, broken with coughing. "Carrie, I can't. I'm slipping." "Hang on." He gasped. "Here. Reach up. My belt." He felt the dragging weight catch at him, there in the smoke-thickened dark, and drew a grim breath and edged himself further, up and up and up. And out. He crawled from the chimney and fell to the roof with the world reeling about him and a rushing of darkness in his head. His tormented lungs sucked the bitter air. He sobbed and the tears washed the soot from his eyes. He stood up and helped Sathi to her feet. She leaned against him, shuddering with strain and with the wind that cried up here under the flickering stars. He looked about, seeking a way down again. Yes, over there, a doorway opening on a small terrace. Quickly now. They crawled over the slanting, ice-slippery roof, helping each other where they could, fighting a way to the battlement until Carrie's grasping fingers closed on its edge and he heaved both of them up onto it. "Come on," he snapped. "They'll be behind us any moment now." "What to do?" she murmured. "What to do?" "Get the pipes," he growled, and the demon blood of Broyina began to boil in him again. "Get the pipes and destroy them if we can do nothing else." They went through the door and down a narrow staircase and came to the 4th floor of the palace. Sathi looked up and down the long empty hallway. "I have been up here before," she said with a coolness that was good to hear. "Let me see, yes, this way, I think." As they trotted down the hollow length of corridor she said further, "They treated me fairly well here, indeed with honor though I was a prisoner. But oh, Carrie, it was like sunlight to see you again." He stooped and kissed her, briefly, wondering if he would ever have a chance to do it properly. Most likely not, but she would be a good companion on Hell Road. They came into a great antechamber. Carrie had his sword out, the only weapon left to him, but no one was in sight. All the royal guards must be out hunting him. He grinned wolfishly and stepped to the farther door. "Carrie," Sathi huddled close against him. "Carrie, do we dare? It may be death." "It will be like that anyway," he said curtly and swung the door open. A great, richly furnished suite of chambers, dark and still, lay before him. He padded through the first, looking right and left like a questing animal, and into the next. 2 men stood there, talking, Jonan and Monku. They saw him and froze, for he was a terrible sight, bloody, black with smoke, fury cold and bitter blue in his eyes. He grinned, a white flash of teeth in his sooted face, and drew his sword and stalked forward. "So you have come," said Monku quietly. "Aye," said Carrie. "Where is the pipe of Kilorn?" Jonan thrust forward, drawing the sword at his belt. "I will hold him, Prince," he said. "I will carve him into very bits for you." Carrie met his advance in a clash of steel. They circled, stiff-legged and wary, looking for an opening. There was death here. Sathi knew starkly that only one of those two would leave this room. Jonan lunged in, stabbing, and Carrie skipped back. The officer was better in handling these short swords than he who was used to the longer blades of the north. He brought his own weapon down sharply, deflecting the thrust. Jonan parried, and then it was bang and crash, thrust and leap and hack with steel clamoring and sparking. The glaives hissed and screamed, the fighters breathed hoarsely and there was murder in their eyes.